No doubt. All right. Well, welcome again, everybody. I know that some people are still joining us, but we will get started. I am excited for today's topic, as always. But I'm joined today by my awesome friend, Robert, who we've known each other for a few years now. Robert is a regular contributor to Church Juice. He's been involved in the church communications world and in our community for a long time. Robert, you're also an author, a published author, and we'll talk a little bit about your latest book. I know in a little bit, but you are a marketer, you're a communicator, and I'm just so excited to have you today talking about storytelling and story basics, because church leaders, church communicators, we are always telling stories, and storytelling is a skill that we can all get better at. And so I'm really excited for today's topic, and I hope that you are as well. I'm sure that's why you're joining, because it's something that you find valuable and a topic and something that interests you as well. So a few things before we dive in and I turn things over to Robert today. On the right side of your screen, you will see a chat window. Right now, you can tell us where you're joining from. You can also answer our question: what fashion trend would you bring back if you could bring back a fashion trend? So you can add to the chat there. That chat will be live all throughout. I will be in there answering questions or just adding comments, whatever. Feel free to use that as well. Another tab on that chat window, there are 4 tabs that you see. The first one is the chat. The second one is Q&A. So at the end of the webinar today, we're going to spend some time with Robert asking questions and answering your questions. So if something pops in your head while he's talking about a certain topic, or you're just curious about something, make sure you add it to the Q&A section, and we'll get to it at the end of today's webinar. We'll also add polls throughout the webinar. Great way to stay engaged, answer some questions, see how other church leaders are answering the questions too. So you can use that. And then the last one that you'll see is handouts. And there's probably a little red icon on there right now. And what you can do is in that tab, you'll see that there are the slides that Robert's going to go through. So you can download those, follow through as he's going through it, or download it and use it again later. But those are free and available for you to download and use and reference back to. So that's kind of how all of that works. Robert's going to go through this webinar, and then, like I said, at the end, we're going to spend some time in Q&A. So I'm looking forward to our conversation as well as Robert's presentation today. But I know you guys don't really want to listen to me talk for the next 40 minutes because you get that a lot. So let me turn things over to Robert. Robert, thank you again for joining us. Thanks for being a part of our Church Juice community, and thank you for spending some of your afternoon helping church leaders and church communicators be better storytellers. And so I'm going to turn things over to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Brian, for having me. I'm excited, like you said, to dive into this topic that I'm really passionate on speaking on, which is storytelling. And it's something that obviously matters to many different business industries, nonprofits, for-profits, but also obviously churches as well, because I certainly believe that the church has phenomenal stories to tell. So let's dive into a little bit about what are the basics of beginning storytelling within your church. So a little bit more about me. Brian obviously gave a lovely introduction of kind of many of the hats that I have worn. So I'm currently the marketing manager at a small digital agency just outside of Atlanta, where I'm from. But I've come from the church communications world. I've worked for several different nonprofits. I've also been a freelance copywriter. I've contributed, like Brian said, to Church Juice and many different other church communications blogs. And then I'm also a published author and have written several books about the topic of storytelling. And we're actually going to dive into a little bit of the content that I share in my latest book called The Story Cycle. We'll get to that a little bit later. I'll tell you a little bit more about that. But yeah, so all of these things that I've done, marketing, communications, kind of all rely on the topic of storytelling. And that's one of the reasons why I'm so passionate in talking about it. So I think we have to kind of begin with a very basic question. It may seem obvious, it may seem a little rhetorical, but I think it's worth spending a little bit of our time right up front on just talking about what a story is, because honestly, I think we have to realize that not everything that we share, even within the church, is a story. Some things are just facts, some things are anecdotes, some things are announcements. And I actually wrote and contributed a blog post just recently to the Church Communications Facebook group that some of you might be familiar with or might be a part of, that talked about why we need to shift from shift from announcements and just blasting our congregation and our community with facts and information, and shift that to stories. And that's not an easy transition to make. That doesn't happen overnight. There's always going to be room maybe for announcements, but we have to be able to tell the difference between what is a true narrative in a story and what is just a pure fact. And frankly, not everything needs to be a story, and that's okay. But we have to know what constitutes a story if we're going to be able to tell the difference between those things. So there are lots of different features, lots of different elements that can make up a story and that go into storytelling. But I always look for these 4 common traits that I think every story needs to have: context, character, conflict, and change. And if you've heard me talk before, you may have heard me mention these things. I kind of always start at this kind of basic point, but it's also worth going over what these 4 things mean in just a little bit more detail. So let's go through them one by one right quick. So the first one is context, because every story happens somewhere. And this can be 2 different things. This is both the internal piece, the setting of our story. Where is it taking place? Is it happening within your church? Is it happening in the global mission field? Is it happening down the street from you at another business or organization? So that's within the story, the context, because that's important. But also the medium, the platform that you're sharing the story on. Where are people actually going to hear this story? Is it a blog post? Is it a video that they're going to see online? Is it going to be shared, in person from the stage or from the pulpit? Thinking through all those things, the internal and external context really matter to how you form and shape the story. The second one, which is pretty obvious and pretty transparent, is character, because every story has to happen to someone. So that's typically the protagonist, the people that we see within the story. And this is so important because people who are listening to your story relate to the people who are within the story. We want to give them a perspective to see the story from, to understand why it matters to them. And the more that we can get our audience to relate to the character that we're telling the story about, then the easier that connection point is going to be made. So character is a vital and crucial piece to any story. Conflict, the third point here, is one that people often overlook and underestimate, because I think that every story has to have a challenge, and we naturally kind of shy away from conflict in our life. We want to tell, especially within the church, like happy stories, and stories can have a happy ending, but there has to be some sort of tension that the character has to overcome. This is the fuel that drives the story forward, because without some sort of conflict, some sort of pain point that the character is feeling, there's no real reason to tell the story. And so that's one of the biggest differentiators between a story and just an anecdote, is the story's got some sort of tension that the character has to overcome and have a resolution for. And then the last one is change, because I think great stories that we tell, especially within the church, are transformative, right? They result in a difference between the character at the beginning of the story to the character at the end of the story, right? So that's really kind of the arc of the entire story. Is we meet a character, they want something, they can't get something, they have to overcome that and transform as a result. So that's getting into the kind of the whole idea of the hero's journey, and there's a lot else that could be said about that. But I think ultimately, for our stories to have a lot of impact, we have to really focus on that change from beginning of the story to the end. So that's a little bit about what a story actually is. So those are the 4 different elements that any of us can look for stories, either fictionally or within the stories that we tell, or even stories that are told within businesses. But one of the toughest things for any church leader, is actually finding those right stories to tell. Right now that we know what a story is, where do we actually look to be able to share those stories? And I think this really begins with a pretty straightforward idea, but it can be a tricky mind shift to make, is that your church is not the hero of the story. Your audience is ultimately the people that you want to kind of highlight and elevate to, within the narrative, and your church is the guide in this journey, right? And this is not an idea that I came up with. This is an idea that's been around for a long time. Donald Miller is somebody who has talked about this quite a bit. So I, have borrowed it from him and other people who talk about this a lot. But I think it's really worth sharing for anybody who's not familiar with this idea, is that you're not the one. It's easy to talk about yourself and your church and the people within your staff and all that kind of stuff because you have that perspective. But we really need to shift our perspective and the focus of the story from ourselves to those that are being served within the church, those within our community, the volunteers, people in the children's ministry, all that kind of stuff. Those are the people that we want to focus on within our stories. And in order to do that, because we're telling true stories within the church, we're not, weaving fictional stories, at least not, usually. So we have to actually listen for those stories. We talk a lot and we hear a lot about storytelling, and that's obviously very important. That's a big buzzword that we use a lot. But I think story listening is a very undervalued and something we don't focus on and talk about enough, because we really have to be able to listen for the stories before we can actually tell them. And the good news is, when you do that, when you actually make that mental shift, you're going to be able to find a lot more stories, because every church, every person has a story, and every church, theoretically at least, has people. And so therefore, if your church and your congregation, your community is full of people, then it's also full of great stories that you can kind of unearth. But that's also easier said than done. So I think there are two primary strategies to listening for stories, and it's active and passive listening. And I think of that as like hunting and gathering, right? The passive listening is just setting out your nets. If you're, thinking about it in a fishing metaphor, right? You're casting your nets. You're kind of letting them sit there. You've got to put them in the right place. You've got to go back and monitor them and pull out what's been caught in the nets. Sometimes that's fish, sometimes that's junk. So you've got to kind of filter through what's being caught in your nets. But then the other side of things is active, right? It's going out there with a spear and actually trying to catch the fish individually. So and you might have the question of which one is better? Which one should my church be doing? Should I be casting nets, or should I be kind of hunting stories with a spear? And honestly, my response is usually you should be doing both. You should be able to cast out those nets. Things like just putting a storytelling form on your church's website, or occasionally asking for stories on your social media platforms or an email, just kind of throwing the request out there for people to share their stories and seeing what comes in. The active piece is actually seeking out individuals, who went on mission trips, who attended ministry events, who were impacted by, the giving of your church, actually finding them and asking them, having an interview or sitting down in front of a video camera and recording what they say, getting their testimonial. And that's a lot more accurate. It takes a lot more work on your part, but it's really usually going to yield a lot better results. And it of course is going to have even better results if you're doing both of those techniques kind of at once. It's going to yield a lot better things. So you also have to be always prepared for that as well. That's one of the biggest things is stories are kind of happening all around you, and you've got to listen for them. But you also, it's not just good enough for you to hear them. You want to be able to actually capture them and share them with other members of your congregation and your community. So you need to always be taking notes, always be prepared to take photos or videos or record people's voices wherever that happens. Thankfully, we all have a device in our pockets every single day that does like all of those things all at once. So sometimes it's as simple as pulling out your phone and shooting a quick video of a person's testimonial. And that's not the most polished way to do it, but at least you've captured something so that you have it on record so you can use that story asset for later. But you can only do that if you're actually storing it in a place where you can go find it later. And so I talk a lot about the idea of a story library, which sounds super fancy and highfalutin, but really that could just be a shared folder on your church's server, a Dropbox folder, or a Google Doc, or something like that. It's a simple central hub where you can actually place everything and basically go back and find it later. All the pictures you've taken, the videos you've recorded, all the quotes that you've gotten from people, again, going on events, mission trips, whatever it is. Anytime you encounter one of those stories, pull it back into that story library and make sure that it's organized and labeled properly so that you can go navigate it. But that just gives you a lot better opportunity to be prepared to tell stories later. So the next step beyond there, once you've actually heard these stories, you've captured the assets, you've saved them in the right place. How do you prepare all that into a story that's worth telling and into an effective story that your audience is going to resonate with your audience? And I think this begins by realizing that we shouldn't just share those stories raw, right? You've captured the video, of the person returning from the mission trip, it's not ready quite yet for you to just upload that to your church's YouTube channel and just let it go, or show it, during Sunday worship. You actually have to do some things to prepare that, because if it's like an uncooked meal, it can make somebody's stomach upset, right? It's not ready quite yet for your audience to hear it, because you've got to do some filtering on your own. And there's really two steps, I think, to preparing and crafting a story to be shared. And the first one is assembling the story, taking all of the pieces that you've gathered and actually putting them together into a clear and cohesive narrative that your audience is going to understand. And one of the biggest reasons you do that is because you have to kind of decide, as the storyteller, what details are important to include or leave out, right? You want to give context for your audience so that they're going to understand why this is important. You want to include details about the character, so we understand why we want to resonate with them and why we empathize with their journey. So all of those things, gathering all the pieces that you've collected together, and then deciding, okay, what do I take in and leave out? And then what order do I actually share them with the audience in? So that's kind of the first phase of story crafting. The second phase is editing, right? That's a lot more the granular detail stuff, making sure that the transitions from kind of one part of the story to the next are smooth, right? Making sure all those really refined details are there, that you're getting everything kind of right. And again, this is very much going to depend on what platform you're going to share the story on, and who your audience is, what the experience you want them to go through is, what the action you want them to do after the story. All those things you want to consider and think through when you're kind of in the editing phase of the story process. And another kind of last detail, another thing to really consider and think through is storytelling is not a solo sport. This is not something you want to do on your own. Sometimes it may feel that way. I understand that as a church communicator who was, in a one-man band for the church that I worked for. I had to do kind of everything myself. But the more people that you can gather around you to tell these stories, that can be other staff members, that can be lay leaders, that can be volunteers or community members, pull all those people together and empower them to help you tell these stories. That also gives you more people to actually add to your story library, right? They're out there capturing photos, videos, quotes, all that to add into the library that you're building. But it also helps you strengthen the stories you're telling, because the more perspectives that you're putting into the story, the more authentic they're going to be, the more trust they're going to be able to build, because your perspective is going to be different from a volunteer or somebody who's outside your church or a business leader within your community. And the more people you can kind of give an inside look into your story and help you in that kind of polishing and editing process, again, the stronger your story is going to be, and it's going to be more likely to resonate with the people that the audiences that those people are representing within your church and within your community. So we've listened for stories, we've gathered them, we've prepared them to be shared. So now that crucial question, that storytelling question of how do we actually share these stories within our church and within our community? Again, the kind of mindset shift we want to take here is realizing that stories deserve to be shared, right? A story that you just keep in your story library, you keep on your shelf, is, it's just going to sit there. It's not going to resonate with anybody or make any sort of impact. So realize that these stories are personal. They're never really going to be perfect. That's why you go through the process of editing it to make sure that it's as good as possible, but you also have to get it out there. And that can be a very vulnerable thing. That can be a tough thing to do it within your church. It can take a lot of guts to actually get up there on stage or in front of a camera and be able to share someone's story. But it's really very worth it. Storytelling is a valuable and vital step with any church, just because these personal testimonials of the people that you're talking to have incredible worth. It's also very important, like I've mentioned a couple times to this point, of knowing who your audience is and what platform you're going to share it on, right? There's written storytelling, there's spoken storytelling, there's visual storytelling through videos and images. And so the best stories can actually apply to all of these things, right? If you're able to gather written, words, video clips, photos from things, all those different types of story assets, you're going to be able to tell stories not on one platform. There may be one best platform for you to be able to share a story on, but you can actually share it on multiple platforms. And that's primarily because the best stories are repeatable. I think if you're spending all of this time to talk to somebody, to prepare the story, assemble and edit it, then it's actually worth sharing the story multiple times, right? Not just once on a Sunday morning, but maybe on your YouTube channel, maybe through social media. Apologies, by the way, if the lawn people outside are causing too much noise. Hopefully you're able to still hear me, but or maybe you'll not be able to hear them all. But anyway, you can share a story multiple times because likely most of your audience won't even hear it the first time. And if it's a good story, they won't mind hearing it multiple times. Knowing who that person who's going to share is. Sometimes you're talking to the person whose story it is, right? They're giving their first person testimonial. You're sharing on a video, you're actually writing down their words, but sometimes the story is being shared by somebody else. Maybe that's your senior pastor or a lay leader or another volunteer within your church. Maybe it's you, maybe you're the person who's actually sharing the story. But knowing and looking for the right characteristics with that storyteller is very vital. And there's 3 different characteristics that I think good storytellers have. That's confidence in both themselves and the story they're telling. Clarity, they want to be very focused. That's one of the reasons why that editing and that assembly, that preparation process is so important, to make sure that the story is very focused and crystal clear. But also that they have care, that they're valuing the story that they're telling. They've got empathy for the characters in the story. So those 3 things, confidence, clarity, and caring, I think are among some of the most important characteristics that any person actually sharing a story is going to have. And I think lastly, one of the most important things that we need to do when we're actually sharing these stories is not just release it out into the ether and just go, okay, I hope that landed with somebody. I hope that, somebody's going to remember that and it, really resonated with somebody. Like, good luck story. Good luck from here. I think good storytellers, effective church communicators, also track how effective those stories are. And that can be very difficult. But as church communicators, we're also kind of marketers, and that's obviously one of the hats that I wear. And so I want to measure the return on investment that I have for putting all of this time and effort into crafting a good story. So a good story is subjective. People may have different opinions on whether a story was good, but as marketers and communicators, we can objectively show whether or not a story was effective. And the primary way to do that is always having a single action step at the end of every story, right? So if we're telling the testimonial of someone who just got baptized within our church, right? That's one of the easiest first steps or first examples of telling stories within our churches, those testimonials of people who were giving their life to Christ, right? So an obvious call to action, an obvious next step, if you've shared that story, is, hey, if this person's story resonated with you, if you're going through something similar, if you can really relate to what they just shared, then why don't you consider baptism as well if you haven't already? Like, here's our information, here's the URL you can go to. We've got baptism Sunday, maybe next month, the same time, whatever it is for your church, but having that clear action step so that you can tie the story and how effective it was to, hey, we had 4 more people sign up for baptisms next month because of the story that was shared. That's a tangible, real thing that you can track back to go, hey, I know this story was effective because this many people actually took action on the story, on the thing that we were calling them to do. So that's all a lot. Those are the 3 different kind of important phases in organizational storytelling, whether you're a church or a nonprofit or even, the businesses within your community. I think that can relate to just about any group of people telling stories. But I also wanted to share a few resources with you guys as well to kind of take the next step and where this goes from here. So as we mentioned a little bit at the beginning of this presentation, I am a published author. I've written a couple books, all of them about storytelling. My most recent book, which was published last month in October 2022, was The Story Cycle. And that basically walks through these first 3 steps, as well as 3 more once you kind of handed your story off to the audience. There's 3 more steps that they go through in experiencing kind of the stories. And that creates basically what I call the story cycle. So if you want to learn more about what I've unpacked today, you can go to the website. There's even more free resources there, or I would encourage you to check out the book and see if it's something that would be a helpful resource for you and your church. Another book that I've talked a little bit about on Church Juice before is the devotional that I wrote a couple of years ago. It was the first book I ever published, called The Original Storyteller. So this is a little bit different because it's not organizational, it's not high level, it's more personal, right? It's talking about your relationship as a storyteller with your Heavenly Father, who I think of as the original storyteller. So I think that's maybe another helpful resource that anybody can check out to kind of get another view on storytelling. And then because I like to read and listen, and I'm just very focused on this topic, and have consumed a lot of related content all about storytelling from a lot of different perspectives. This is another kind of PDF that is free that you can go to that website and download and check out even more books and podcasts and webinars and all that on this subject of storytelling. So it's a few resources to kind of take it from here. And Brian, I know you shared the deck with everybody, but here's also a QR code that you can scan to download everything, as well as my email address and website, and where you can find me on social media, all the things kind of from here. So that's my spiel. Hopefully it was helpful to everybody, and happy to answer some questions now.
Yeah, thank you. I know that, I've read a lot of Donald Miller stuff, and different authors that talk about storytelling. So I always appreciate just the approach that you take to it, because it feels a little more personable, in the same, like, whether it's original storyteller and just kind of the personal, like your personal story in that too.
Mm-hmm.
Or just how we develop stories and think through the storytelling process. So so I appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you.
For those of you that are watching, taking part in the webinar, feel free again to add questions. But I have a few to get us started. But yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to throw them in that chat or Q&A window, and we'll get to them in the next little bit. So my first question for you is going back to the whole hero concept. I know in talking with churches, a lot of churches or communicators have a hard time getting over this concept, because we're always taught, and it's obviously true, that Jesus is the hero of the story, right? Or that we are characters in God's story. So how do you recommend for someone who's preaching, or someone who is, communicating different stories in the church world? How do you I guess, navigate those that tension a little bit?
Yeah, that's a good one. And I was thinking through that from a church leader's perspective when I was actually sharing that during the presentation. So it's a very valid and understandable question. And I think it's kind of caught up in that word hero, right? We mostly use it because of Joseph Campbell's hero's journey, right? I think some people may be familiar with that idea of what the cycle kind of every story goes through. But I think we can kind of balance those two things and realize that Jesus. I actually think of Jesus more as the resolution to the story, right? The hero is just the protagonist, and what Brian, you'll be familiar with, because Donald Miller talks about this. Like, the hero can sometimes be a schlub. Sometimes the hero doesn't fully get it, right? The hero is like us; they're flawed. They're not always going to understand, or they need a guide like the church to be able to lead them to kind of the better place. They need the guide to help them overcome that challenge. So hero is kind of I don't know, it's just a tricky word, but I think that, Jesus is the resolution, because that's what's better. He's the solution to our problems. He's the thing that helps us overcome our challenges. So we're not trying to elevate ourselves or the subjects of our stories to that same level as Christ. It's just that word of, hero is kind of almost synonymous with main character or protagonist, I think, in this case.
Yeah. So as someone is thinking through, I guess how they tell stories, or how they're creating stories, there's also kind of this question of, I guess, in churches, how do we get permission to tell the right story? What does that look like? What are those conversations like? I know some organizations just have a general rule that they change names no matter what, and they don't use real pictures. They use, change up the pictures, things like that. But when you're sharing someone's personal story, obviously there is a little bit, like you were talking about, a little bit where it is personal and it's a little raw, no matter how much you edit it down. But
Right.
What does that permission look like? How do you gather that permission to tell that amongst a broader context?
Yeah. And I do bring that up in a little bit more detail in, the book, because I think that is a very valid thing. And ultimately, I think it boils down to relationships, right? You're not going to be able to share, you're not going to be able to learn about somebody's story and be able to listen to it unless you've gotten to know the person whose personal testimonial you're hearing in the first place, right? So sitting down to, lunch and break bread with somebody, or going over coffee, or having a few phone calls with them, like you have to kind of have that exchange at first, and that initial relationship, to be able to even hear the story, right? But then actually earning the permission to say, oh my gosh, like this, you overcoming this obstacle in your life is amazing, like that's so transformative. Can I share that on stage? Like that's another huge leap, to be able to get there and have some people have the confidence to be allow that story to be shared. And like you said, it's a personal thing. It's going to be different for each individual. Sometimes some people are ready to go and they want to share their story, right? They want to be able to help people like them overcome similar trials. But in other cases, they're just never going to be ready for it. It may just take time to be able to get past that thing that they've gone through. So, but you're not going to know that unless you've talked to that person, unless you've heard it from directly from them, and then also you've asked them directly, and hopefully not with any pressure, hopefully not with any strings attached, to say like, hey, we would love to honor you by elevating your story and by sharing it with the whole congregation. But if you don't feel comfortable with that, then there's no pressure to open up, and maybe you're going to be ready in 6 months or a year, or maybe you're never going to be ready. So that's another one of the reasons why I like that story library, is kind of share, like you can still collect and gather those things, and maybe just put a note on there that says, hey, this person is not ready to have their story put out there yet, or maybe they may be more comfortable with kind of being, shared anonymously. Like, we could change their name so that kind of protects them a little bit more and makes them feel comfortable. So yeah, that's a very tricky thing, but it really boils down to relationships and the trust that you're able to build up with the subject of the story who's you're telling.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And yeah, I guess another question that kind of goes to a question that Jeff asked here in the chat is, as people think through telling stories in a church context, there's often two ways that I think this comes about. It's someone standing in front on the stage, giving a profession of faith or their testimony, their story, or whatever, or there's something that's written, and
Mhm.
it's 3 pages long of someone's life story. How do you navigate both? I guess both kind of sides of that. Um, so you have people who are coming up on stage talking through their story. You also
Mhm.
have written content. How do you decide what content is for the front of the stage, and what content is better written, versus you also have people who aren't comfortable going in front of
Right.
this, in front of a crowd or whatever. So how do you navigate those waters, especially when it comes to in some denominations, in some traditions, where telling your story, your testimony, your profession of faith is part of the process
Sure.
of discipleship and faith formation. So tradition is that you must go in front of the church and tell that story, but obviously there's a lot of facets to that too, right? A lot of people are not comfortable public speaking. So what does that look like? I know that's a huge loaded question, but how do you navigate those waters? How do you decide what the best way to communicate a story is?
Yeah, that is a big topic to tackle, and I mean a very understandable one, especially within the context of the church and people's personal stories. I mean, I think it ties very much into what we were just talking about, of having that relationship of knowing that person, knowing what they're comfortable with, of knowing your congregation as well. Like, are they going to be able to sit there and listen to a person share their story for 10 minutes? Like, is that the appropriate space to be able to do that? So there's several different kind of important factors to consider. I think another one that we probably often don't think about is like, what are we trying to get out of this story? Why are we
Hmm.
sharing the story with the congregation, or why is it being recorded on video and then shown, during worship? And ultimately, I think it should have some sort of clear action step. I think I shared that like there needs to be a clear outcome from this. That the person's testimony is overcoming addiction, and so you mentioned, like, hey, by the way, we're starting an addiction recovery ministry or something like that that's going to be happening here. So like having a clear purpose really helps. Sometimes people's testimonies don't always fit into those nice boxes of knowing exactly what that clear call to action is, but that does kind of make it a little bit easier to know when and where and who should share. It is obviously a lot trickier when, personal testimonials are an important part of your denomination. And I think there, if it is a clear piece of like, hey, they need to be able to grow in their faith, they need to kind of get up in front of people and share, either create a separate space, like a group that meets once a month of people who want to hear stories and people who want to share their personal stories. Like, maybe it doesn't have to happen on Sunday morning, it could happen in another place. But then also, if you're going to have a ministry like that, coach those people up. Give them the kind of tips that they need to have those three characteristics of a storyteller, and have confidence and clarity and compassion, right? Make sure that they understand those three things and know where they're strong or weak, so that when they do get up on stage, they're not rambling on for forever because they're not clear or concise of knowing what story that they're actually trying to tell. So again, there's so many different directions that you could go with this very loaded question, and we could almost do an entire presentation on just this, like the sharing of your personal testimonial as a story. But hopefully that gives it a little bit more, if you know which action you're trying to do, and maybe creating almost a separate space so that it's dedicated to this storytelling aspect.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think too of a preaching class that I took, and instructions from the professor there about how a lot of the stories we tell are step down stories. So basically, we just give way too much context that really isn't necessary. You just need to dive in and tell people, basically the four things that you opened with, right? You just need to tell people what happened, why, and what that should drive someone to do.
Yeah.
So I think there's a lot of that happens too. I'm curious, switching gears a little bit, for churches who are, I guess this is probably a lot of churches, but I think there are a lot of communicators, pastors, whatever, church leaders who are interested in telling better stories, who want to do a better job of that and have ideas of how to do that. But creating and building the culture of both, like you were talking about, active and passive listening. It's a hard thing to do. How do you get that started? I know you talked about, putting like a form on your website, but often it takes a lot for someone to actually want to fill a form out too, right?
Sure.
And it takes a lot of relationship building to be able to go to someone and have that conversation. So what are some ways that a church can just get started and build the foundation for that, I guess, both active and passive listening? How do we gather stories? What does that look like?
Sure. I think, like so many changes and cultural shifts within any church, is getting leadership buy-in and making sure that, from the very top, from the senior pastor, from the elder board, or whoever's kind of setting the tone for your church's culture, to make sure that they're bought in and make sure that they care about it and make sure that they're willing to announce it from the pulpit, or talk about it on stage, or talk about it on Sunday, or like whatever, have those conversations. Like, the tone so often within the church begins with those leaders, and it's going to trickle down from there. And if you're the church communicator and if you're the only one promoting it, then it's really fighting an uphill battle, and it's going to be that much harder. So getting buy-in there, and that's going to make it easier for, to have buy-in from the staff, buy-in from the volunteers, from the congregation. It just kind of ripples out from there. So that's the first place to start. But then I think once you actually begin doing storytelling on a regular basis, showing that it is a priority, that, hey, we're going to tell at least one story every Sunday morning, whether that's through video, whether that's spoken. We're going to put, storytelling elements on our website through a form, maybe through, narrative blogging formats, like whatever that is, like finding those ways to actually express storytelling within your church to show that it's truly a priority. Because all day long we can sit there and talk about how much we like stories, but unless it's actually being put into practice, it's not going to actually be shown to people. That will hopefully slowly start to build up the momentum, and people will say, oh, I've got a story to tell. Can I come share? And so they might look on your website and find that form, or they might approach you or the senior pastor, whoever, and say, hey, I would really like to be able to get up there and share my testimonial just like this person did. I think that's the way to do it. And also recognizing that that's, like with any change within a church, it takes time. It's a transition. It's a mindset shift first, but then it's a cultural shift after that we have to really be able to get people used to it. And it can take people within a congregation a little while to adapt to those things, but know that, again, if you've got the buy-in, if you have this as an actual priority within your church, that you're going to start seeing the long-term benefits slowly down the line.
Yeah, I like how you started that answer by saying it's really it starts at the top. It starts with the leadership and getting everyone to buy into it. And at first, my thought was, I feel like we use that answer a lot. But the truth is that it matters, right? And also, I think that also puts more responsibility on more people. So it's not just the pastor, it's not just the communication leader who is gathering the stories or who is having these conversations and trying to, actively listen to stories. But now, when you involve all of the leadership, then it's all of your elders that are, as they're talking to their people in their district or whatever, like they can share those stories with the church staff, and different ministries can do that, ministry leaders. And so you're really involving more people. And so you have a wider breadth of, of stories coming in too.
Absolutely.
Um,
Can I interrupt you for a
yeah.
second and
Yeah.
add one more layer to that? Because I mean, one of the things that some people on this call may be thinking is, well, that's great to get buy-in from my leadership, but that's a lot easier said than done. And I think that's the other side of this as well, is like, well, how do I get buy-in? And I mean, that's not always easy. It's going to depend on who your senior pastor is, who your leadership is, and maybe they're not going to budge and not see the value in this. But if you're interested in doing that, it almost sometimes you have to do like the chicken before the egg thing,
Mhm.
and maybe try to tell stories in the space that you can control. Like if you're promoting a mission trip or baptisms or something, like try out storytelling like almost as a case study and see how it works. And again, if you're able to show how effective it is, to say like, hey, we did announcements for this event last year, but we tried kind of more of a narrative approach, this year, and we got 25% more people to sign up, and a lot more people were actually showing up who RSVP'd for it. And like, you've got actual numbers to show, hey, this is the difference between just blasting people with information versus sharing a story about it. And you go to that you go with that information and that data to your leadership, they might be a little bit more willing to buy in, rather than just going, oh yeah, storytelling, sure, but like, oh yeah, why wouldn't we want 25% more attendance on our events and
Mhm.
this much more giving and this many more things? Like if you're able to prove it with numbers and figures, it becomes a little bit easier for you.
Yeah, that leads to another question. Early on in your slides, you talk about how not everything is a story, and there are announcements that take place.
Mm-hmm.
So, in just the example that you gave, how do you decide when something is better as an announcement, or when we should try incorporating more story into the way that we're communicating this event or whatever it is? Is it simply trial and error, or is there more to it?
I mean, it probably just practically begins with trial and error. It also probably practically begins with, do you have a story to share about this thing, right? Because you may have the big fall festival that's coming up next week, and you don't have any stories to share about it, right? So maybe that just has to be an announcement for now. But we know, okay, this year we're going to collect testimonials, we're going to shoot videos of people, and we're going to get quotes, and we're going to like do all this kind of stuff of the impact that the fall festival had,
Mhm.
so that next year we're going to be prepared and we're going to have a story to tell about this. So I mean, practically speaking, you just have to be able to work with what you've got. And that's why I think starting that kind of story library and that process of gathering is really important. And start sooner rather than later, because it's going to take time to build those things up. But yeah, I mean, I think the second part of that is where are your priorities? I think if you've got three announcements on Sunday morning and you tell all three of them as a story, it might start to water it down a little bit. So maybe you pick the one that's the most impactful and that
Mhm.
you've got the best story to share, and you share that story, and you really pump up that event or ministry or whatever it is. And then the other two you announce, in normal fashion. So it it's a real judgment call. I mean, I don't think it can be, I mean, it doesn't necessarily have to be overly complex. Just decide what's going to be most effective and what stories you have to share, and then work from there. But yeah, that balance can be really tough between sharing stories and sharing announcements. But I think typically we're way more on the announcement side. So any sort of shift over to storytelling to balance that out is probably going to be helpful for most churches.
Oh, that's helpful. So switching gears a little bit, I'm going to take Amy asked this question that I think is good fodder. So she asked for written stories. A lot of churches still do the mail newsletters or
Mhm.
send regular written content to their congregation. So for written stories that we share, what is the optimal length of a story? Like, when do you start to lose people, or what does that look like?
Yeah, that's A great question. And I mean, it so often depends. I even think it kind of depends. I mean, because written is similar, but like, is this a email digital newsletter we're talking about, or is this a printed physical newsletter? Because I think there's a big difference there. Typically digital, you want to go shorter is better. And if we're talking about like an email newsletter, I think giving like that hook, what's the thing that's really going to grab people, make that real short and sweet in the newsletter, and then link out to your website with the full story that you can make as long as you want to. In a print piece, which is obviously static, and you're not going to be able to shorten that up or link people out. I mean, I think you've got more time, because if somebody's actually dedicated enough to pick up a physical, newsletter, or I mean, even a bulletin. I don't know if churches are putting stories within bulletins, but if they're actually taking time to look at a physical piece, they're going to probably take a little bit more time to actually read through something. So, I mean, I think sometimes you yourself can be a judge of that, of like how long are you willing to sit and read a story. And it also matters how, like, frankly, how interesting it is. If you've got a testimony that just doesn't have a hook or isn't grabbing somebody, maybe try to edit some of that stuff down and make it a little bit shorter. But I mean, like, some stories are just, I mean, most people like myself are willing to sit and watch multi-part, hour-long documentary series for hours and hours, because the story is so riveting. So I think the idea of people's attention spans being too short, it's just we're less tolerant of boring stuff. There's so many good things to choose from that you're competing with Netflix and Disney and Twitter and Facebook. Like, it's basically, can you grab somebody's attention away from those things long enough? So if you've got a really compelling story, and again, that's a very subjective thing, but if you've got something that people are really interested in, then yeah, you can make it a little bit longer. So I know that's not a specific answer, because there's really no way to get specific. It really is objective, dependent upon your platform, dependent on your audience, and depending on what, how good is the story that you have to tell.
That's good. I have one last question from Jeff here in the chat. He asks, what indicators might a person look for to develop storytelling talents in the congregation? So are there any good tells or any good characteristics that you should be looking for?
I mean, I would probably revert back to those three that I mentioned. Like, if they've got confidence, if they've, you can usually tell if somebody's got stage presence, right? If they're not shy to be able to get up there and talk, or, not shy to be able to get in front of a camera. That's usually a pretty good indicator, right? That they will be able to stand up in front of an audience and be composed. Being able to be concise and not ramble on, because again, there's plenty of people who think of themselves as storytellers, and they have interesting things to say, but they include way too many details that are just distracting the audience off in different directions. So listening to an example of that person's story and just seeing like how direct and to the point were they able to get to what they were saying in a succinct way, or did I find myself kind of drifting off halfway through? I think that's another big one. And then that empathy, I think, is really important. And that's really like, how well are they able to understand their audience? How well do they like play to their audience? Are they able to like talk to the kids ministry or the youth ministry, like at their level? I think all of those kind of things are very important. And the tough thing is being able to see them in an environment where you can tell all those things at once. And so sometimes, yeah, like testing somebody out on stage or in a smaller ministry or in a Bible study or small group or something like that, and seeing how they perform and how well they're able to kind of use those storytelling techniques. I think that's probably going to be the best way to, like, recruit those volunteers to be able to then get them onto your kind of storytelling ministry within your church. But yeah, those three are probably the biggest indicators of what I would look for in a storyteller.
Yeah, I think that's helpful. Yeah, I really just, again, want to extend my thanks to you for taking today, this afternoon, for an hour out of your day just to spend with us to talk through storytelling. I found that I even gathered some things from this, and I'm not regularly in front of a church. So I think that there's a lot that the church leaders who are taking part in this today have gathered. So before we go, I just want to point out again to all of you watching that you can see here on the slide that Robert has provided you with his contact information. So if you have questions, feel free to reach out to him. I know he's active on social media, but you have his email address there too. And I highly recommend that that you go and get both of his books. I think they're both incredible and worth your time. So try to do that and support Robert in his ministry as well. Yeah, we will have our next webinar after the holidays. So be on the lookout for that. If you haven't already, make sure you head to churchjuice.com, subscribe to our email list, and we'll keep you informed on everything that's happening for church communications here in the US and in Canada. And appreciate your time. Have a great day, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.